Good evening. I would love to start my presentation by expressing my gratitude to the original custodians of this land and the ancestors, and then to say a really big thank you to Atta for letting me share some thoughts with you today. And another really big thank you to my wonderful winter family, with whom I traveled throughout this gorgeous country earlier last week. And my profound appreciation and admiration for Namibia tourism. As I said, I'm a veteran of working with tourism destinations. 40 years, should give up soon. But I can say in all that time, these guys beat them all. And finally, I'd like to say what a privilege it is to be up here on the stage together with my winter partner, Chief Ian Campbell. We make a great duo. As you can probably tell from my background, my accent, etc. Grew up in England, had very much a traditional education. It was all about the brain. And that's one of the things I've really enjoyed traveling with winter, because they bring me always back down through my heart. And with Chief Campbell, we have a guy with enormous heart. It's also interesting because I'm wearing the pants and he's wearing a skirt. And he's got bells on too. Now, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And some pictures, however, can change the entire consciousness of a generation. And this is one of those pictures. It's called Earthrise. It was taken by one of the astronauts on Apollo 8. It was beamed down to Earth on Christmas Eve in 1968. And I can even remember where I was that day. This picture literally triggered the birth of ecology movement and the environmental movement. Now, 45 years ago, that picture was a bit of a marvel, and Fred Hoyle, 20 years earlier, had suggested the kind of impact it could have. And we're now so used to this image. I have it as a, on my computer every time I wake it up. But each of us have different ways of interpreting or perceiving this image. For some, and I suspect not many in this room, it represents almost a chunk of floating real estate. Land, minerals, resources, wildlife, flora, fauna, that can be used to make and sell stuff. In the 60s, it became fashionable, thanks to Buckminster Fuller, to talk about Spaceship Earth, our support system. And more recently, thanks to Lovelock, it is now recognized by the majority of scientists that it is, in fact, a living organism. And that's the perspective that the indigenous peoples of the world have always had. For them, it is, and for us, it is Mother Earth. It is Pachamama. And they know, because of their deep relationship with Mother Earth, that she is in distress. Now, it also happens that most governments around the world know that too. It's just they're not so keen to tell us all that they know. But business is waking up very, very quickly, and I'm astounded at the pace of change. I want to share a little bit with you two reports. I'm going to start my presentation by setting the context in which we're working in tourism. Try not to be too dry. I'll get through that as fast as possible. My entire presentation will be on the web for you tomorrow to read and look up the references then. So we'll go through this quickly. But I just want to draw your attention to this one, because this was produced by Kate Speet-Marwick, the KPMG, the consultants, and I think we all know the big five consultants have a reputation for being fairly conservative. They usually have a caveat after every other paragraph, just in case they illegals get involved. So can you imagine my surprise when I read this report in 2010 with these statements in it, this boldness, this clarity, this inconvenient truth that perhaps we don't want to recognize, that if we fail to alter our patterns of consumption and production, things will go badly wrong. Now, they identify 10 megaforces, and I'm not going to go into them. But the key thing to remember is, again, they didn't just list them this time. They really tried to understand how they all interact and interconnect. And more recently, the Davos World Economic Forum interviewed over 1,000 of its members to look at the issue of risk. This is real hardcore business issues. And they found 50 risks. And again, look at the words, the potential for a perfect global storm. Finally, big business especially is only too aware that we are in a serious predicament. Now, it's becoming really challenging because how do you handle 50 separate sources of risk when we're beginning to understand that each of these risks is utterly connected and interrelated with the other? We can't tell anymore which is going to perhaps be the wild card that will cause things to come down. So I know you can't necessarily read the items on this, but it's simply up there to show you the complexity. Small events have the potential to trigger major catastrophes. Radical quantum change can take place in an instant. And finally, you'll hear experts answer penetrating questions with simply, "We do not know." Now, some might find that scary. I find it actually quite encouraging, because when they say that, there is an aura of humility that we've been sadly lacking, I think. So in this interconnected world of ours today, planning is becoming almost impossible. Prediction is certainly impossible. And only the American military could come up with an acronym for this. They call it, we are living in a VUCA world, where VUCA stands for incredible levels of volatility, up and down. Incredible levels of uncertainty. In fact, that's the only certainty we have left, that we will be living in an uncertain future. Complexity, this interwovenness, this interconnection, which again makes it very difficult to predict. All we can do is be prepared for more shocks. And finally, ambiguity, which makes decision-making that much more difficult. Now, that's the world that we and tourism are inhabiting. We are living in it. And I draw your attention to this because I spend a lot of time looking at tourism destination strategies, and they're also incredibly optimistic. They're so incredibly certain that we will grow tourism by 3%, 4%, in some cases even 5 or 6%. And I often wonder how they can have that degree of confidence. Now, the challenge we're in right now is that mass tourism, the one that I've grown up with, that's taken us from a few million people when I was born, now to 1 billion people traveling internationally, borrowed that production and consumption model, which KPMG is saying is actually unsustainable. Tourism is therefore subject to the same excesses and intrinsic weaknesses of the overall system. And after the war, we basically looked to manufacturing for all of our operating models. We turned places into products. We turned travelers and guests into consumers at best, tourists, or at worst, market segments. We turned, as I said before, places into products and exotic experiences into packages that now can be rated and compared by some robotic computerized algorithm. Using this production and consumption model and following all the rules, we started to obsess less on customer fulfillment and happiness and more on efficiency. And we've seen the introduction of automation, standardization, homogenization, and all of those other izations in order to cut our costs, because we're now competing in that mass market largely on price and not on value. And we're getting ourselves into trouble. And I think another image that I really like, it's obviously, I hope this image is photoshopped, but I found this on the internet because I think it expresses the precariousness of mass tourism in the main. We have an artificial capsule only suspended in its position by a bit of engineering against the rock face but utterly dependent on a living tree. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but here's the challenge. We talked about volatility. Tourism is incredibly volatile. The demand is volatile because we don't control it. It's also something we sell a perishable product. If you have a departure of your tour leaving today and people don't turn up for it or they don't purchase it, you cannot sell today's departure tomorrow. It's perishable. We have customers now that have access to almost perfect information. As I say, God forbid if they introduce a search and compare engine into adventure travel. I think that would be a real disaster. But what this means is whenever there's a blip in demand, the natural thing to do, if you're a hotelier or whatever, is usually to drop your prices. So we've had years and years of systematic price discounting, which is resulting in incredibly thin margins and declining yields, both for the operator and for the destination. As a consequence, we are growth dependent. We have to get bigger. We have to grow volume. And what that is leading to now, with the emerging middle classes, etc., the huge amount of demand that sits behind all this, is increasing congestion, lower deteriorating experiences, an unwillingness to pay more. We've created this insatiable thirst for global travel, provided it's cheap. But the only way to make money with that model is to get bigger and bigger or acquire other businesses. Now, please, I'm not anti-tourism and I'm not negative, because I'm here because there's enormous hope in what we're experiencing in Namibia. I am, however, pro the kind of growth that matters, and that is the growth in net benefit to the host community, the guest, and the operator. And right now, that's in steep decline, and we have to reverse that trend. So I was extremely pleased. I attended your conference last year in Lucerne and listened to the head of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, Mr. Taleb Rifai, whom I respect enormously. And he came to Lucerne with huge enthusiasm and sat on the podium with Shannon and said adventure tourism is what tourism ought to be today and what tourism is going to be tomorrow. And we all felt absolutely fabulous. It was a great honor in a way. It was also a great responsibility, but what on earth did he mean? Is adventure travel the future just because you're growing faster than everyone else, like indigenous tourism is also outpacing general demand? Or is it because it models a better future for tourism? So in that case, is it better as opposed to more? And how can we make that better form of tourism the norm and not the exception? And what does better look like anyway? And that's why I suggest that we need to do three things. We have to ask questions that involve us waking up, growing up, and stepping up. And by waking up, I mean taking off the blinkers, waking out of a trance that says that we can continue to grow indefinitely on a finite planet, and become aware of the situation we're in. The word conscious simply means to be awake, aware, and alert. It means making mindful, informed decisions and not being willfully blind just because it's inconvenient to face that truth. Our indigenous brothers and sisters are adamant. Throughout the planet, we're hearing indigenous people come forward and saying, wake up, learn to see the world in a very different way. Because how we see the world will affect how we are in it and what we do in it. And many scientists, cosmologists, economists, deep thinkers are all saying exactly the same thing. We have to wake up. We have to see a change in our consciousness. This is Jeremy Rifkin. He's one of the senior advisors to the European Union. He's a brilliant American. He's written something like 25 books. He's demonstrated that we have all of the capacity to live without fossil fuels. And Europe has started down that track, albeit with difficulty. His last book was The Third Industrial Revolution. It's required reading throughout the Chinese government. But the most important thing I think he said was, we have one generation, that's our generation, in which to shift human consciousness if we want to have a hope, in hell, of getting out of the predicament we're in. So that means I suggest that we have to grow up. Growing up means passing from adolescence, when it's all about growing up physically, getting bigger, to adulthood, when we stop getting taller, but start developing emotionally and mentally. When we transition from adolescence, we shift from thinking about me, thank you, to we. I'm colorblind, by the way. There are all these cards coming up. I can't see them when I'm colorblind. But I don't want to be thrown to the lions, so I'll... Anyway. So the next thing we need to do, I would argue, is not constantly pound the table and say we're so important. We need to pound the table or go up to our brothers and sisters in other economies and say, how can we serve? What can we do to get us out of this situation? And that's what stepping up is all about. The future is about generating the highest net return for all stakeholders. It's about protecting scarce resources. We actually all are going to have to become activists, warriors. Chief Campbell has grandmother told him it's about warrowing up. We're going to find ourselves on the front line of conflict as we fight for our resources to operate our businesses. And we're going to have to use our close relationship with our guest to help change their consciousness, one guest, one person at a time. I think that's the opportunity, because the interesting thing is, in most cases, the consumers are ahead of the marketers. We're finding we're living in a period of absolutely enormous change in terms of value. And why do we know that? Well, every one of us probably knows where we're at in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What's happening in the Western world particularly, but not just the Western world, we see signs of this throughout South America, throughout China, India, everywhere. People are rapidly having their basic needs met. Not all, obviously. There are very many poor people who have very little, as we saw just now in the video. But most of us have well met our so-called deficiency needs. And on this curve, we're right there in number 4, which is about looking to grow personally. And that is what's driving this enormous change. I'd hazard to guess that most of your customers are at level 4. They're looking at their own personal growth. They're trying to find personal meaning. That's 5. They're starting to ask the question themselves, what can I do to make a difference? And again, I'll rush through this very quickly, but a major study in the States identified over 100 million Americans that have started that quest, asking, who am I? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? How do I grow? All of those kind of questions. And here's the beauty of adventure travel. This is the real opportunity I see for you. You're involved in both helping your clients have an inner adventure. This is a journey of becoming, where they stretch themselves, where they push themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It may involve an activity, but it's much deeper than just getting on a bike and just jumping off a cliff. The outer journey also involves a much closer relationship with the natural world. And it's by appreciating those 2 aspects of adventure that you're going to be able to make a major contribution to that shift in consciousness I've said is really important. And I would argue, once you start to take care of those 2 aspects of the inner world of your customer, you're going to make an awful lot more money than you did when you just thought they wanted to get on a bike or they wanted to go hiking. So there are 5 quick things I would suggest that you could do right now to really adjust, and many of you are already doing it. We've seen it throughout Namibia. First of all, I really ask adventure travel people to join up with the responsible travel people, the sustainable travel group, the eco-tourists, the fair trade tourists, the geo-tourists, and yes, the conscious travelers if you want. But let's break down these silly boundaries. They don't mean anything to our customer, and start to join hands. As I said, support your guests' inner and outer journey. Stimulate all of their senses. Don't just think of the activity. And I say that because when I was in Lucerne, walking around all the stands, it was always seemed to be activity, activity, activity. And place came second. Inner benefit of that activity was barely mentioned, although I'm sure many of you understand what I'm saying. Fourthly, really invest in the setting of that activity. What makes the place where that activity is taking place so different? because each place is unique. It took 13.5 billion years to get to that point. Why would you discount it? It's also unique, so why would you sell it at a cheap price? And I think in the future, you're going to find that you're going to be hiring a different kind of person to offer that wide range of fulfillment. Change makers with a range of talents that might be cooks to counselors to storytellers, conventional ecologists, spiritual ecologists, scientists, biomimics, shamans, artists, and actors. You see, I would ask the question, I've answered it for myself or I wouldn't be here. Are you the ones in tourism that we've been waiting for to take that leadership position? I believe you are, because we need people like you that are often quite unreasonable. This is a quote from Bernard Shaw. Or to pick up something from Steve Jobs and Apple, a lot of you, thankfully, are crazy troublemakers. You certainly see the world differently, or I hope so. Are you enough of that to take a lead? So going back to Talib Rifai's challenge, I would suggest what he was asking the head of the Atta tribe. He was explaining that he needed you to set forth, to set sail into the sunrise against the prevailing winds and find a new land. And that, I believe, is what your responsibility and opportunity is right now. And to do that, Shannon, being the wise chief that he is, would know that, and has shown that he knows, that most navigators on those Polynesian ships sailing into the sunrise against the wind were actually shaman, extremely wise people. And that is the reason, I believe, why he has had the prescience to create a very close linkage with the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance, many of whose key players are in your midst right now, and you'll be meeting them a little while shortly. I've just spent, just need a little water. I've just spent 5 amazing days in their company. Now, these are the values that Indigenous people hold really dear. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, these are not words on a wall or a drum or a banner. These are written in their hearts and lived every day of the year, and it's profoundly changed my life as a result of having had that. Indigenous people understand that when you want to build a ship, you don't just start collecting the wood, cutting the planks, writing a business plan, distributing work, but you waken the very heart of the people to a longing for the great and endless sea. For the real task right now, for you as operators dealing with people, is to help people get into a right relationship with Mother Earth, Mother Nature, for she is us and we are her. So that people can look into a lake and by looking, measure the depths of their own nature. You're not in the shock and awe business, you're in the wonder and awe business. And as Pico said the other day, we look about protecting the wild, humanity protecting the wild. It's the wild that preserves our humanness. You have the chance to move your guests from numbness to aliveness, from indifference to empathy. Your higher purpose, the real reason for getting up in the morning, is not just to sell another tour. It's to help your guests fall in love with life and Mother Earth, so that they too can read the love letters sent by the wind and the rain, the snow and the moon. We have 1 generation left to shift our relationship between humans and Mother Earth, from ignorance to curiosity, from superiority to deep respect, from meanness, mean-spiritedness to gratitude, from extraction to regeneration, from indifference to activism, and from disdain to love. I believe you are the ones we are waiting for. You are not alone. Our ancestors and our spirits are here to help us. Thank you for your time. Thank you.